F1 games are usually the main entry point for a casual motorsport fan into the world of sim racing. While it's easy to forget when you work somewhere like GR&R HQ, there are people out there whose only motorsport experience is watching F1 on the telly. These fans are unlikely to be attracted to Project Cars or Assetto Corsa, but you can be certain they'd reach for the game with Lewis Hamilton's face staring back at them from the cover. While the sport as a whole has changed significantly over the past 3 decades, the F1 game market has, if anything, come on even more. These are our favourite Formula 1 games ever made. And if you do enjoy this video, please remember to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more from Goodwood Road and Racing. Believe it or not, there was a time when a perfectly rendered Grand Prix circuit just wasn't available on a video game. Instead, you had to live with the extremely pixelated versions of a very basic version of the F1 calendar. But even then, on F1, the track undulated, and you even went under bridges and through tunnels at Monaco. Actually, the bridges and tunnels seem to bear no relation to the actual circuits themselves, and the backdrops leave a lot to be desired by today's standards. But in the early 1990s, this was mind-blowing stuff. F1 gave gamers the very best experience possible and was one of the first F1 console games to truly capture the sheer speed of the pinnacle of motorsport. You can't have a list of the greatest F1 games ever without including something from Jeff Crammond. A former systems engineer in the defense industry, Crammond had no real interest in motorsport when he started programming PC games. But in 1984, he tried his hand at developing an F3 game, and, well, the rest is history. 7 years later, Microprose released its first game based on Formula 1, and it was an instant hit. Despite lacking any official licensing, the game featured groundbreaking physics, thanks in no small part to Crammond's degree on the subject, and also featured fairly accurately modelled circuits, meaning racers could finally identify their location on track in relation to real life. Such was the success of F1 Grand Prix that it spawned 3 sequels, all with official licensing, and by the mid-90s it was regarded as one of the greatest PC games of all time. Microprose truly were the kings of sim racing in the 1990s. And the next on our list is one of the greatest sims ever, even today. While not a traditional F1 game in terms of sticking you behind the wheel, Grand Prix World was the last and most polished of the Grand Prix Manager series. Microprose and F1 cashed in on the hugely popular management sim genre, Hello Championship Manager, and Grand Prix World was just as detailed then as Football Manager is today. It wasn't simply a case of setting a strategy and hoping for the best. You had to very carefully assign your budgets across the departments. Do you put your backing behind a strong R&D program? Or do you splash the cash on signing a big name like Schumacher, Hakkinen, Newey or Braun? You even had to sign technical directors. There are few F1 games that bring a greater sense of achievement than bringing Minardi up from the back row of the grid to a fully works-backed squad fighting for the title. Grand Prix Legends was launched in 1998, and it is only now, nearly a quarter of a century later, that the original is starting to lose some of its popularity. Produced by Papyrus, who were most well known for their incredibly realistic NASCAR and IndyCar sims, the developers delved into the history books and produced a game centered around the 1967 season, inspired by the film Grand Prix. No downforce, no slick tyres, no runoff. This game perfectly captured the difficulty of racing in the late 60s and still holds up today. Many an avid sim racer still logs hundreds of hours on this game, and the popularity shows. An all-new demo version of the game, made by an unbelievably big modding community, was released at the start of 2020 to entice those who aren't sure whether they want to part with their hard-earned money on a 22-year-old game. The answer should be an easy yes, as the same modding community has also expanded the game extensively to include everything from Formula 2 to Can-Am. Formula 1 97 was the second game in Sony's Formula 1 series, and featured the dulcet tones of the one and only Murray Walker. It featured every driver and team from the 1997 season, barring Jacques Villeneuve, who wouldn't license his name, and the Lola team that didn't last long enough for the game to be produced. You could choose either arcade or Grand Prix mode, depending on what level of realism you were hoping for, with the latter giving you the full championship experience with the challenge of fuel load, tyre wear, and even contact damage to contend with.
That was almost certainly a collision.
It's that cross-section of realism and pick-up and playability that makes the perfect F1 game, and this was one of the first to truly fit that formula. The early 2000s was a fantastic time period for the gaming F1 fan.
Physicality's running fast, right in front of you.
While Sony was continuing with its series that had started in 1996, sports gaming powerhouse EA Sports joined the scene in 2000 with the imaginatively titled F1 2000. An exclusivity deal between FOM, FOCA and Sony from 2003 onwards meant that EA had to stop at the end of 2002. But rather than just ending it there and then, EA Sports decided to create a new game, focused on the seasons that had been previously licensed. This meant that 4 seasons were now playable, instead of just 1, something unheard of in previous F1 games. Not only would teams and drivers change across the years, but small adjustments were made to the tracks to provide more authentic time progression feel, and give F1 fans their first true taste of a career mode format. Something that later games would push further and further. F1 fans were forced to wait a good few years for a proper F1 game in the late 2000s, but in 2010, Codemasters snapped up the rights and began churning out yearly iterations. While the first few were a little sketchy at times, come 2013, the Warwickshire-based company found a format that worked. F1 2013 was the follow-up to a rather lackluster F1 2012. There wasn't much wrong with the previous offering. It was just a bit, well, boring. Cody's pulled it out of the bag for the sequel, giving F1 fans their first proper opportunity at driving cars and tracks from yesteryear since GP Legends. Largely focused on the late 80s. If you didn't want the sound of screaming V8s, you could swap them out for a growling DFV. They even threw in a filter and custom graphics to enhance the classic car experience, a nice touch that many appreciated. The classic cars were a welcome addition and provided a break from the annoying yet very accurate, extremely high tyre wear from the 2013 cars. The newest game from Codemasters doesn't make this list.
I just don't get it, Zoe. Gets to pit ahead of me.
While it adds an extra element with the new Breaking Point mode, in which players follow a storyline, there's just not a massive amount of upgrade from 2020.
This kid is the new #1 driver.
So, the next on our list is the F1 game just gone, F1 2020. F1 2020 took a format that Codemasters had developed well and added a few extra trinkets. Firstly, it fixed some, shall we say, quirks in the physics from 2019. Secondly, the My Team mode was added, which has spawned a million YouTube Let's Play series. Here, you create your own 12th team to join the F1 entry list. You choose who to purchase an engine from, and of course, the higher the price, the better the engine. But splash out on your engine and you lose money for your second driver, who you originally pick from the 2019 Formula 2 entry list. Starting at the bottom, you would then have to utilise the R&D, which has become a hugely expanded part of Codemasters' career modes, to try and work your way up and see your team go from back row minnows to World Constructors champions. It's not all perfectly simulated experiences in the world of F1 gaming. In 2012, Codemasters decided to release a Mario Kart-esque game to its repertoire, alongside its more serious series, featuring every car and driver from the 2012 season, plus 2 additional fictional teams with female drivers. Players compete on tracks loosely, very loosely, based on the real-life circuits for their countries. For example, Silverstone only really features a cartoon version of the start-finish straight, before the cars head down a British village, get snapped by a speed camera and head through a car factory, a nod to the number of teams based close by. Other examples include taking on the Ferrari Rossa roller coaster at the Abu Dhabi track, and driving across an American football field in Austin. With a mixture of power-ups and weapons much like the other kart races it was based on, this was definitely one for the casual racer, although no doubt someone somewhere has already modded it into Grand Prix Legends. Any of the more serious F1 fans saying it was a waste of time are just kidding themselves. It was a lot of fun. That then is our list of our favourite F1 games of all time. But what have we missed out? Let us know in the comments below.